Hi, everybody. My name is Ken Rosenthal, and I am a park naturalist at Gulf Branch Nature Center in Arlington County, part of the Department of Department of Parks and Recreation. My manager, right after that stumble, is Rachel Tolman, and she's going to be the moderator. She'll be keeping an eye on the chat. Some of you may have a little symbol with a hand in which you can raise your hand, just like in a classroom. Feel free to try that as well. I think Rachel will be able to see that, but I know for sure she'll definitely notice if something's going on, and if someone puts a question in the chat, and she'll try to go ahead and cut in, interrupt, or in any other way get my attention at a decent time. I see a couple people don't have their mics muted. I want to remind you to keep your mics muted if you could. That cuts down on the background noise. And again, if you have your camera off, it also will hopefully keep me from looking or sounding choppy and preserve some bandwidth for you. So I'm going to go ahead now, and I am going to, I think I did everything I want to do. I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop. So get down to that. We're going to go to, I don't want you guys reading my email. And we're going to go start the slideshow here from the beginning. So this is another deep dive. We're going to be talking about parasitism today. I recognize quite a few names. So if you were with me last time, you remember we talked about symbiosis. I very much enjoy symbiosis. I think it's one of the neatest concepts in ecology. It's an interaction between individuals of different species, and it's not necessarily a fleeting interaction. This is usually probably a better way to refer to it would be an association, because there is a long-term, there's a longer time scale to it. That's why predation is not considered predation is not considered part of symbiosis, because it's very quick and brief. So, do that. There we go. Parasitism is one of, I can't remember if it's 6 or 7, maybe even 8 types of symbiosis. And in parasitism, you have a parasite and you have a host. And the parasite usually benefits to the detriment of the host. It can be a little, it can be a lot. It's always usually in the parasite's best interest to be, the less harmful it is, the longer it can sustain itself from the host. Although there are parasites which will take to the point where the host dies from the association. I stumbled across this quote. I thought it was fantastic. Parasites in a phrase are predators that eat prey in units of less than one. Now I know I just told you that predation is not a symbiotic relationship. And it's the only part of this I would disagree, but I just love the idea of eating prey in a unit that is less than one, where they are taking, small sips or small bites or small nibbles, whatever the case may be. And I thought it was a very neat way of looking at it. The word parasite comes, there's a lot in here, but it really comes originally from this Greek term, parasitos, and the initial, you can see the translation is one who eats at the table of another. And this was initially a reference to people who were maybe funny or had good conversation and would often be invited to eat with politicians or other people who had more means, who had more money. And again, what they got out of the association was, humor, good conversation, good company. And what the quote parasitos got out of it was a meal. And initially it wasn't even always about meals. It was just about somebody who was hanging out. And eventually it got turned into this term that we now use, parasite. It was, I think, initially appeared, first used in English in 1539. Parasitism as a word didn't appear until until 1611. I feel that the word parasite, and sometimes I've heard people say it and they just really accent that last syllable, parasite, and it's just really got a lot of anger and negative connotation around it. It's been used a lot in, someone got their mic on? Get that muted, please. A lot of background noise. the word parasite has a lot of negative connotations. So typically when you think of the word, especially in popular culture, it's never been the hero of the story. It's always been a villain. Oh, I got ahead of myself. Parasites have been around a long time. Fossil evidence is really tough for parasites because if they're soft-bodied, they're not going to fossilize well. Certainly, internal parasites are less likely to leave any kind of impression and might not be fossilized because they could decay or other things before the fossilization process occurs. We do have some prehistoric evidence. Hopefully everybody can recognize that this tick is in amber. It's certainly preserved from prehistoric times back around the times of dinosaurs. And then this on the right is a Tyrannosaurus rex, and I think everybody will be able to see my cursor as I'm moving it. There's this is a hypothesized illustration of an infection from a, I want to think it's a tristosome, and I'm probably saying it wrong, where they're showing the effect of it on the jaw and also on the inside of the mouth. And this is from a very specific fossil. I think it's called Pex rex, P-E-C-K is the name, whether that was the landowner or the actual paleontologist who discovered and found it, I don't know, but it's it's actually a distinct fossil, and it has these holes in the jawbone, and that's where they think, and that's what they think it was, is as a result of a parasitic infection on the Tyrannosaurus rex. So it's just very interesting to me to think of one of these large, massive predators, which has certainly been, I don't know if the word glorified is true, but it's certainly been celebrated in our pop culture in many different ways, in movies and cartoons, to think that it would have a infection of its mouth. But it certainly makes sense. I'm sure they had their share of parasites as well. In popular culture, just quickly, parasites tend to really capitalize on the EU factor that many people get, where they can be, have sharp claws, and be very creepy looking. And if you've seen these movies, the life cycle is certainly very creepy as well. To the villain that you can't touch in the Superman comics, because if you touch them, he loses his powers. I'm not going to get into that too much with you. To last year's big winner at the Academy Awards, the South Korean film Parasite, which is a dark comedy about somebody moving into this house and changing the dynamics, among other things. So we certainly have a, I don't know if it's love-hate. I think there's a very big interest in parasites in our culture, and they're fascinating, but it's definitely the same way that people are fascinated by horror movies, where there's just an ew factor or an oh my goodness factor. Would love to give you a number of how many parasites there are, but if any of you went through in the last couple of years, like the Army training where we had the general ecology, I always do a little bit about how many species there are and what we do and what we don't know, and obviously some species die off before we know. The problem with parasites is it's even harder to model them in many ways because they have an aggregated distribution. And what this means is, if you look at the number here, if you've got a population of hosts, most of the individuals in the population don't have a parasite. There might be a few with one, and as you go to higher numbers of parasites on a host, the number of hosts that have that number goes down. It's a very steep curve here. So you're going to find an aggregated distribution where a few individuals have most of the parasites in the population. So a random sampling might not even yield an individual parasite, or certainly wouldn't necessarily yield the number of individuals that would make it obvious to how many there might be in a population or how many parasites. And let's say you sample, 10 fish, and you cut each one open and you look for parasites. You could find completely different numbers and completely different species in all of them. Or if it's a close population, you might find them all very similar and miss, scores or hundreds, maybe thousands of parasites that are able to use that species for food, and you'll never see them in your survey because even though you tried to randomly survey, you only got this small number of fish. So it's problematic. I have seen some numbers where people have tried to do the best calculations they could, and they've said that 40% of species are parasites, which is incredible. That's an incredible number. And they have even went so far as to say there's so many of this type of parasite species in each mammal species. It's just incredible. So we are, in some ways, walking, talking hotels for lots of smaller critters. And I know that'll make some people anxious, but it shouldn't. A lot of times the ones that are there, you're probably not even noticing. So two different places to find parasites. One is on the inside, parasites that attach themselves or benefit from the relationship from the inside of the body. And this is the head of a tapeworm. We'll talk a little bit more about tapeworms a little bit later on. But these are endoparasites, so they're inside. And then have ectoparasites, which I think most of us are much more familiar with. I chose to highlight this little guy. We found him on one of our summer camp journeys. We went out to flag ponds in Calvert County, and we were sampling from the little tidal pools and trying to get crabs and all kinds of other things, and found this, and I just was, it was like nothing I had seen before. It just struck me as so different, and I was super excited, so I took a picture and tried to figure out what it was, and it turned out to be a kind of amphipod. Now we have certain species of amphipods you'll see in our fresh water and ponds and pools and things like that. One of them is called Gammarus, Gammarus, which is a really common genus of freshwater amphipods. This is a, I hope I'm going to say this right. I don't think I printed out a cheat sheet for me. A Symathoid amphipod, and they are actually ectoparasites on fish. And if you check out ectoparasites on fish, you'll eventually run across some of these, and they can be really startling at how big they are when they're attached to some fish. But my favorite, this is my all-time, this is probably what really sparked my interest in parasites maybe 10 or 15 years ago, is this little guy here. And this is one of the few times where I'm really bummed that I'm not in front of an audience so I can see people squirm at this one. But if you look in that fish's mouth, that is not its tongue. That is an amphipod. And what these amphipods do is they swim in through the gill opening on the fish, make their way to the mouth of the fish, and slowly chew away the tongue, biting at the blood vessels until they get rid of the tongue, and then they replace the tongue in the mouth of the fish. And in this way, they get some food from the fish. They do obviously deprive the fish of some food. In fish where they might have more than one, which is even more stunning to me. Imagine having two or more of these guys in your mouth. The fish might be underweight for what's the typical range for a fish of that age and in size and whatever species that may be. But the fish seem to do okay. There's not a lot of information on what happens when the fish dies. They do know that, or it has been observed that the amphipod will crawl out of the fish's mouth and it's outside, but how it finds another fish is another story. But it's thought that when they're young, when they're floating in the water before they attach themselves to their initial fish, that they can sense them by smell or possibly even sight. So, but that is again my favorite fish, or one of my favorite parasites is just this idea that it goes in and completely replaces a body part. And these are called mesoparasites because they're kind of inside but not completely inside. So those are kind of, those three terms will give you an idea of where the parasite is located on the host's the body of the host organism. So this is it's a massive, very massive topic. I was joking with Rachel earlier that I could do 10 weeks of this, an hour each week, and still not scratch the surface of it. So what I thought I'd really focus on is the major strategies that parasites use. So we're going to talk about those, and excuse me, and I'll have some local examples, I'll have some exotic examples for these, and we'll talk about how these work. And then I have some variances on these strategies. And sometimes what you find is some of the parasites use more than one of these major strategies. So there's a lot of, if you think of a Venn diagram, there's a lot of circle overlap between these. So there might be ones that use more than one strategy to survive. But and some of them have really complex life cycles. They're just really fascinating ideas. So I'm going to start with the parasitic castrators. And these are parasites that essentially when they get inside of the host will inhibit the host's ability to reproduce. This could be so that the host diverts more of its energy towards growth, and the parasite can benefit from that because of the way it's feeding on the host, or they could use the host's reproductive process to actually reproduce themselves. They might just be they feed on it. Could be that the host is sterilized because of a chemical that the parasite releases. It could be a lot of different things. What's fantastic is, I'm gonna make sure I get this correct. This is called Saccharina. When the Saccharina, and that's this yellow sac in the middle here. Oops, I'm pointing, and you guys aren't going to see that. Here we go, pointing this yellow sac that's in this abdominal cavity here in this crab. When Saccharina finds a crab, they walk on it. Literally, this small little larval Saccharina walks on it. Here, let me go forward one slide. So these are typical barnacles. Okay. The parasite I'm talking about, Saccharina, is in the barnacle family. It's in the barnacle family not because it makes this kind of growth, but it does go through a life cycle like this. But instead of settlement and metamorphosis on a surface, like this pier, or I think we've all, if you've seen pictures of whales, at some point you see a whale that's got barnacles on the top of its head or under its chin. But instead of doing this kind of settlement, after the larval stages here, which are free floating, after they find the crab, they'll walk up the leg of a crab until they find a joint. And then what happens is they will molt into a form called a kentragon, and it essentially injects itself, the soft body, into the crab while the shell falls off. So now that Saccharina is inside the crab, it grows, it emerges as a sac, which is called this sac here, which is called the externa, on the underside of the crab, and this is the rear thorax of the crab. And this is where the eggs would be incubated in a female crab. Okay, if the Saccharina, if the female Saccharina implants in a male crab, which is fantastic, is they will actually interfere with the crab's hormonal balance. It sterilizes the crab. And the crab's bodily layout, the male's bodily layout, now that it's sterilized and it's receiving and its hormones are being messed with, it will actually change the bodily layout of the crab to resemble that of a female crab. The abdomen will widen and flatten, among other things, for one thing. And the female Saccharina can then force the crab's body to release hormones, causing it to act like a female crab. This is to the point of where they will actually see male Saccharina crabs with this parasite performing female mating dances. If the parasite is removed from the host, the male crab will not actually regain its male gonads. It'll actually grow partial ovaries instead of testes. It's amazing. That's how much that this parasite will change that. Female crabs can actually, normally regenerate their ovarian tissue, but it will not happen. The same rebound would not happen for a male crab that gets infected by this. So, and then the other thing is this Saccharina will actually use the crab to disperse its larvae. It can release its larvae, and the crabs do this thing where they kind of stir the water with their claws, and the parasite can actually get the crab to do that same action, and so help the parasite release its eggs into the water and stir it up so that they're getting dispersed. I just wonder if the crab can sense if that parasite, when that parasite lands on or not, what's about to happen or has any inkling. And in some populations, the 50% of the crabs are actually infected with these parasites. And the other thing that's interesting is this species of crab, I think this is a green crab, if I remember correctly. This is found in Europe. These crabs have moved to other bodies of water, but the parasites have not moved with them. They've pretty much stayed to the marine habitats of these crabs, which is probably good news for other crabs. Where these new crabs may have moved in. Another means of getting from one host to another, or getting the host, is being directly transmitted. And this is pretty obvious for us. I think I love this picture here in the upper right of the human head louse. I think most of us, if you went to public school, you're pretty familiar with head lice transmission and how we get around it, not sharing clothes, not hugging and things like that, which is kind of a bummer. Similar, probably in some ways, to what we're going through. Fleas, which can go from, which can certainly feed on their host and can move from one host to another, especially if you have more pets or if your pets give them to you. And ticks, which can move back and forth, can move to hosts and will also switch hosts. So directly transmitted, essentially, they're moving, they're physically moving. They're often lying in wait and they can catch on. And obviously, mosquitoes can go from host to host. These are very, for the mosquitoes, obviously, it's a very fleeting relationship. You're going to talk about this being long term, and it's almost more of a long term relationship with the species than it is with an actual individual. So they're kind of pushing the time classification of being a parasite. But they take a little bit. They're not eating the whole human, obviously. They're just taking a little blood meal to make some eggs. This is a really interesting type of parasite that's directly transmitted. This is a cymid amphipod, and if that means nothing to you, we can try a different name. Let's call it a whale louse. I don't know. On my screen, there's a window over it, so I hope you can see it. There's a little, down here, there's a little measuring bar that shows you what 2 millimeters is. So these are actually really small, but they do inhabit whales. They inhabit dolphins and porpoises. They can be spread from whale to whale, from dolphin to dolphin, porpoise to porpoise. They tend to prefer areas on the whale where they're protected from water currents. So any natural body openings and wounds, genital folds, all those different areas, they will get right in there and hide. I've seen them both listed as parasites, and I've seen them listed as commensals. It's a big whale, and they will consume algae off the body of the whale. They will also consume some tissue. There are cases where whales can get small infections from this. So they're definitely not a very painful or really irritating parasite. I can say that because I'm not a whale. I don't have the experiences. But I don't think if they are, I can understand why some people might class them as commensals, because essentially their activities probably have very little impact on the whale's overall being. But if they are eating tissue, if they do occasionally cause an infection, they aren't. That is definitely dipping your toe in the parasite pool as far as the species is concerned. But I just thought this was a beautiful picture and a fabulous parasite to talk about. Another strategy, if you're a parasite, is trophically transmitted. Somebody eats you. You get in there, and that's how you get in their body. This is a tapeworm. I wasn't able, this is a public domain image, so I wasn't able to get this any bigger with any good luck. But I think that's a 10 and 11. And if this is a ruler, this looks to be like a 20-foot long tapeworm, which is pretty impressive and a really, really creepy thing to think about. This is an oncosphere, and this is one way in which trophically transmitted parasites like tapeworms can get to a new host. So let me go back here for a minute. Each of these segments, okay, is if I remember correctly, they're called a proglottid, and these are hermaphrodites. So each of these segments has male and female equipment, for lack of a better way of putting it, and so they can reproduce without finding another tapeworm. Certainly if they end up in a host that has multiple tapeworms, and certainly multiple tapeworms of the same species, they can sexually reproduce, but tapeworms don't need another tapeworm to reproduce. And they will pass these oncospheres through the host, and so the host will leave these droppings, and the tapeworms can actually emerge from this and move around, or they can be picked up and eaten by other animals. When the oncosphere is eaten by a predator, it's going to survive the digestive process and then mature into an adult. And so and many of these will live as intestinal parasites, where they're often can burrow in the intestinal wall. They can let food flow over them. Some of them are unable to digest compounds or foods or things they need to grow, and so living in the intestines where they're getting digested materials washing across them, and they're able to absorb that, is what they need in order to continue to reproduce. Tapeworms are another one where I think I just get that kind of ick factor. This is another, these trophically transmitted parasites are another ones where you have that aggregated distribution, and obviously that would make sense if you've got one member of a population that has these. It can quickly spread if they're in close contact. Autoinfection can also occur sometimes. These trophically transmitted, there is a ton of different organisms that do this. Lots of worms, lots of intestinal parasites, lots of internal parasites. These tend to be endoparasites, ones that are going to end up in your body, living in your body. Book's falling over here. This is my, if I have a favorite trophically transmitted parasite, this would be it. I'm going to spare us all the difficulty of that large Latin word, and I'm just going to call it the brainworm. This is one that was really came to our attention, and by our I mean wildlife biologists and scientists, probably in the 60s. In Minnesota, in the early 1900s, like 1912, I believe, there was a neurological disease that started sweeping through the moose population. And what was happened was they were noticing declines in the moose population. The moose, in some cases, were they walk in circles. They would end up blind. They might lose their fear of humans, and they were dying. And they couldn't figure out what was going on. And they had an outbreak of this in the late 20s. They had another one in the early 30s. And they discovered Sundow's disease, but they still weren't sure what was causing it. And it wasn't until the early 60s that they discovered this meningeal brainworm that was causing these moose to die. But they still didn't know the source of it. Well, once they figured out where the brainworm was, they could trace it back and found out that this is a worm that was found in the deer. Now, the white-tailed deer have a acquired resistance. So the white-tailed deer are not as dramatically affected by it. They might show some mild symptoms. They don't tend to have those severe symptoms that the moose were experiencing that was killing them. But the deer are spreading this worm larvae through their feces. It gets picked up, as you can tell in this diagram, by things like slugs or snails that absorb it through their foot. A lot of these worm parasites can live in the soil, and so you'll find that with a lot of these as well. And so that's how they get picked up by these organisms. So the deer accidentally eats it, gets infected, eats an infected slug or snail. And this is actually fairly common for a lot of herbivores that feed on plants, that they sometimes inadvertently ingest small invertebrates, which can be poisonous, or in this case can transmit a disease. The worm larvae goes through this deer stomach wall and migrates to the spinal cord. This is just absolutely amazing to me that this is happening. They lay eggs inside the deer's brain. The larvae hatch, get themselves into the deer's lungs where they're coughed up, swallowed, and then end up in the digestive system and out the back end. Now, they can continue to repeat this, and this happens often in the white-tailed deer populations. But what happens is when you switch over to something like a moose, and this can also affect elk, and it can affect caribou, mule deer, even goats, alpaca, and it rarely might happen to cattle or horses. But it can affect these other species that don't have that same acquired resistance. Their resistance is much lower, and so you'll see these more severe symptoms in some of them. So this has been a big issue. When I worked in Cleveland, we used to go down Dogwood Park a lot. And this was a big concern up there because, as many of you might know, deer are really they do really well on an ecotone where you've got a forest to a field where you've got an edge, especially for forested ecosystems where you get that edge, and so suburbs and some areas where people live tend to really provide that. Excuse me. Tend to really provide that edge. So the deer do really well. So as people expand and continue to make these edges and really cut into large tracts of forest, these kinds of habitats favor deer. Well, as the deer population moves, as people move into more wild areas so that they can have more wilderness, but they make yards and they tend to cut that forested patch up, the deer tend to follow the people. And you'll get these encounters where you end up in a wild area with other large hoofed mammals that are susceptible to this parasite. One of the theories is that the grassland biome would protect this, was kind of a barrier to this disease between the deer and these other large animals, and that grassland biome where it is not there anymore. You'll see this disease spreading into these areas further north, like in Canada. Where out west you don't see this nearly as much as you do out here in the east, where there's still a lot of grassland in certain areas. You know, even that I think is probably getting smaller. But it's just fabulous. Now the other thing is, if those worms aren't able to get out when the moose dies, this is also, you know, kind of a dead end for the brainworm if it's not able to get back out of that moose's carcass. So it does end there. But and this might be why you have a die-off in the moose population, like in Minnesota in the 20s. You had 3 years where it was really bad, and then it wasn't too bad, and then because it's kind of a dead-end reservoir for the parasite, and then it comes back a few years later as the moose population rebounds, and then they come in more contact with the deer. I'm not trying to give you another reason to be upset with the white-tailed deer, but it's interesting. This is one of those ways in which, as a species moves, they can bring new things into new areas, and one of those things can be parasites. So I spent a lot of time here on the trophically transmitted, vector transmitted. I'm going to also do us all a favor. I am not going to go through the entire malarial life cycle, but malaria and protozoans, a lot of really small microorganisms that are parasites, these tend to be vector transmitted, where they depend on another species to deliver them to their host. And malaria is one of those. The vector obviously is the mosquito. I hope we're all familiar with that. Where the mosquito can deliver malaria, but then it can also take the gametocytes away and essentially propagate or continue the malarial life cycle. And so there's a lot of steps here and a lot of unique words. Excuse me, we're going to go ahead and not, like I said, not get into that too much. I could probably do a whole night just on malaria, but I'd have to take a class on it myself first. It's really impressive. But yeah, I did have a note here. The single-celled microorganism is from the Plasmodium group. There's 5 different Plasmodia that will produce malaria, and there's one that is more malignant. I don't know if the right word I want, that has more severe symptoms and can include death as a result of infection. And then there's one that has a really mild form. So, when you get malaria, it's not always going to be, it can't always be the same, because you could have a different type of malaria from other people. And there is some acquired immunity. So if you get malaria, recover, and get the same malaria again, you might have milder symptoms. But it's not an acquired immunity that lasts very long. It won't go past months or years. And again, it's not like that Plasmodia gets in your system and woohoo, it's time to rock and roll. They also have, these organisms also have adaptations to help them get past your body's defenses. Your best bodily defense is your skin. It's absolutely a wonderful defense against so many things that really want to get in your body and reproduce, and so that's really, really important. Parasitoidism. Now, this is my favorite strategy. I just find this fabulous, fantastic. As you can see, that caterpillar, probably not a big fan of it. Those white objects that you see on the back of this caterpillar are actually pupa of a wasp. Let's go ahead and talk about this here. And this is a different species of caterpillar. This is, I think, one of the slug caterpillars. This is a catalpa sphinx. We have a catalpa tree out next to our pond. And I've been watching for the catalpa sphinx caterpillars because there's always a bunch of them. In fact, the last 2 years, most of the leaves that were chewed off of the tree, they really did a number on it. But what inevitably happens is there's a nice, beautiful caterpillar here. This little structure at the end of the body, just really gives them a neat look. But what eventually we'll end up seeing, because we'll see so many of these on here, and again, this might also be, as I mentioned earlier, about that aggregated distribution, is that because there's so many of these guys here, it really benefits the wasps that show up. So these are These are from a type of a group of wasps called Braconid wasps, and this is a species in the genus Cotesia. And what happens is the wasps locate these eggs actually could be already infected. I don't know, but the wasp locates the caterpillar. The wasp stings the caterpillar and lays eggs inside the caterpillar's body. The larvae hatch and begin to eat the tissue of the caterpillar through, I doubt it's instinct because we're dealing with really small critters here, not a big nervous system, but probably through an avoidance of certain chemical signatures. The larvae of these wasps do not eat the major organs of the caterpillar. So the caterpillar continues to live, it continues to move, it continues to eat. Meanwhile, it's being eaten from the inside by these larvae. When the larvae get large enough that they're ready to pupate, they will actually reemerge through the skin of the caterpillar. And this is an exoskeleton, and it might be a little softer because they do have to shed that skin, caterpillars do, in order to get bigger. You'll find these shed skin periodically. So the caterpillar has these larvae emerge, and then they pupate right on the caterpillar's body. So what you're seeing in this middle picture and in the picture to the right are tiny little cocoons of these wasps. So these wasps are very small, and they can be, if you have trouble seeing small things, they can probably be impossible to hatch. Last year, I actually did get to see a couple of these wasps emerging from a cocoon just by happenstance. Happened to be there looking at them and saw one come out of a cocoon while we were watching, and it was fantastic. And then so in this upper left corner, you see these cocoons. This one's still closed, but like this one here, like just like lids off of a can, or or a hinged door and something. Where these are open, these are where the wasps have survived and successfully emerged from the pupal cocoon. So it's fantastic. This is actually, some of you might be wondering, this is a different type of caterpillar where I got this picture from. And off the top of my head, I'm blanking. I think this might be one of the dagger moths, but this is definitely a catalpa sphinx. And they don't get them all. They don't get every caterpillar that's out there, but they certainly, on the ones where they do sting them, they get, as you can see, a number of cocoons, a number of young inside that caterpillar to survive. And then we have micropredators. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, before I forget, let me come back here. Parasitoids kill their host. Their host doesn't survive. So parasitoids it includes these kinds of wasps where by the time you reach this point where all those cocoons, pointing with my finger again, all those cocoons have come out of that caterpillar is probably barely moving. It's still attached to the leaf, which is good, and that might be all it's able to do by this point. And that caterpillar will die. It will not survive that kind of infection or infestation, however you'd like to look at that. And so it's not going to survive. So this caterpillar is never going to become a moth. Once they get stung by that wasp, I think their fate is kind of sealed as to what's going to happen inside them. So, if you're a moth or a caterpillar, a moth or a butterfly, obviously this is one reason you lay many, many eggs. Now again, I think that the advantage for these wasps is that there's so many of these caterpillars on this tree, as opposed to just a single, just looking for a single caterpillar might be by itself on one of these plants. When there's so many, it makes it more worth their time spent trying to reproduce by finding a tree that has several potential hosts on it instead of one or none. Micropredators. There's our mosquito again. Down here is a leech. This is actually a medicinal leech from Europe, and this is a lamprey. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, mosquitoes can kind of, some people might look at them as a predator because they stop for a bite and then they're gone. There isn't a long-term relationship between them and their host. It's kind of a quick hit and keep on going. Whereas some of the other predators we talked about have, definitely have adaptations for being in it for the long haul. So that's what a micropredator is. Essentially, they take a quick bite, very little bite, and they move on. Sea lampreys, excuse me, not sea lampreys, lampreys, only half, or a little less than half, I think there's 38 species of lamprey, and only 18 of them are actually carnivorous. And of the carnivorous lampreys, half of them are actually migratory. And so I'm trying to remember the direction if they're going freshwater, saltwater, freshwater. But either way, you can't, if you don't have a species that you're feeding off of that is also migratory, then you can't migrate. You know, you can't be a long-term parasite on a species if it's not going to go the way you want to go. So being a micropredator, being able to grab a quick bite from a fish and then move on is a beneficial adaptation to your lifestyle. You can see they got a sucker-like head with a funnel. They got these really sharp teeth that they use to cut through the initial layer of the fish and then feed on the blood and fluids inside. You can see this one's right up in the gills of this poor fish. And I think that what I'm circling here above the guy's middle finger, I think might actually be maybe a scar or a lesion from a previous lamprey bite. So that's what these micropredators do. Take a little bite and they move on. I had a leech on me once when I was working in Reston. And I remember panicking a little bit. I was in the water setting up a turtle platform, but leeches have the end where they feed with a sucker, but they have a sucker on the other end too, which they use to anchor themselves. And I think that's what was actually on me, was just anchored. It wasn't actually interested in me. If I remember correctly, excuse me, most of the leeches around here are not interested in warm blood. We don't taste very good to them. They're more interested in cold blood and animals that are ectothermic. And so I don't think a lot of leeches in our area, at least, that are interested in us for food. Wish I could say the same for the mosquitoes. Another micropredator that I think many people are familiar with is the vampire bat. If you look down here at the picture C, you can see the little incisors on the bat, and that's what it uses to dig a little groove. And again, obviously you can't see the young girl, so the reason I used this picture. But it shows the incision in her head where a bat fed her and where she was sleeping. I don't know how often vampire bats actually do prey on sleeping humans, but this is probably something that you're more likely to see where they live, and this is an incision on the ankle of a cow, and that's how they feed. And this is, I think, probably a larger micropredator as far as that group. I don't think you're going to get much larger in size, because if you think about how big a cow is to these small bats, that is a pretty impressive approach to go up to something that big and then bite it and then drink its blood. They do have a anticoagulant in their saliva, so once they do make that incision, they're able to keep the blood flowing so it doesn't clot up, because that would end their meal. I believe that anticoagulant in their saliva has been used and looked in for research and used for some medical purposes as well. Wow. We're running out of time here. Some variations on these strategies. I'm trying to not go through these too quick, but move a little faster than I have been. Hyperparasitism. This is, hopefully you'll remember, these are those cocoons from a Burkhanid wasp. This guy in the middle is a chalcid wasp. And he is actually going through and probably going to parasitize some of these cocoons. Actually, some of these are open, so it might be a little late. Who knows? But hyperparasitism is essentially being a parasite of a parasite. And especially in wasps, unlike probably any other group, there are parasites of parasites, and there's parasites of parasites of parasites. In fact, there is, in several oak tree gall systems, this is a gall, which is a growth produced by a wasp on a oak tree. There are 5 levels of parasitism in some of these systems. So that's a lot of parasites on parasites. But that's hyperparasitism. Essentially, your strategy is to find the other parasite and use them as the food for your young. Social parasitism. Some of these strategies we're going to talk about now are really more important for reproduction. This is Bombus bohemicus. It's a type of bumblebee, and this is from Europe. And she is able to mimic the chemical cues of other bees. And what she can actually do, excuse me, is get into social bumblebees' layers and imitate them and actually start reproducing and having the workers in that colony take care of her young as well. I don't know if she replaces the queen or if she just finds a place where she can act like the queen, where the queen can't find her. But it's a fantastic strategy. So essentially, is this solitary bee that tricks a group of social bees into taking care of her young for her through some chemical cues. There's also another type of social parasite, as there's an ectoparasitic ant that's found in Europe, and it was discovered that this small ant would essentially live off and literally on another ant, and that's how they spend their entire life. And E.O. Wilson, who I mentioned earlier, has actually referred to this as the ultimate parasitic ant. The ants don't have worker caste, they don't have queen, they don't have males. They live entirely off the care of another species of ant called the pavement ant, which is amazing. Brood parasitism. This is, I'm sure, one that some are familiar with. I know a couple people on this group of birders, so probably wouldn't surprise anybody to realize that egg, one of these eggs doesn't look like the others. That egg down there in the lower left corner is a different species, and that is from a brown-headed cowbird. The cowbird gets vilified, and I can certainly understand that because they are nest parasites. This is an eastern phoebe nest. These 5 other eggs are eastern phoebe eggs, and most of those eggs, unless the photographer removed that cowbird egg, most of those other eggs probably did not hatch or were not successful as young, because the cowbird eggs typically hatch quicker and push their siblings or the other eggs out as soon as they're able to. Their eggs are often colored similarly to their host, although as you can see here, this one is definitely not. Cowbird eggs are also a little thicker, and so it's harder for a peck to peck through and kill them. There are some bird species around here that are really good at pecking and killing eggs. It's also because they're trying to take over a nest cavity, but in this case, they might not be as successful at breaking these eggs because they are a little thicker. The brown-headed cowbird is a brood parasite because it traditionally followed large herds of large mammals, and they would feed on the insects that were disturbed as the mammals move through grasslands. And if you're depending on animals that are moving constantly, you can't really start a nest and then hope another group comes through. So you follow that herd, and then you leave your egg behind for somebody else to raise and hope it works out. But when your egg hatches first and tends to be the largest one and outcompetes the other siblings for food, well, you'll end up with a scene like this from our parking lot a couple years ago. These 2 cardinals were taking care of this cowbird chick, and that's cowbird chick on the right. His mouth really big and his wings up, yelling for more food. Again, it's a great evolutionary strategy. Cowbirds also, like the white-tailed deer I mentioned earlier, tend to do really well in an edge habitat, the edge of a woodland. And so they have had the cowbirds have had a more significant impact than probably historically they would have in this kind of edge habitat on songbird populations. This is something I just learned, and I couldn't pass this one up. So the top bird's the European cuckoo, and the bottom one is a sparrowhawk. European cuckoo is also a brood parasite, but the European cuckoo is also a mimic, and that cuckoo is, with its colors, can look very similar to some songbirds, like a sparrowhawk, which is a predator of small birds. And by looking like a sparrowhawk, it actually buys that cuckoo extra time to do what it needs to do, which is lay eggs in another bird's nest, because the birds might come back, and instead of going after the intruder in their nest, they're going to give it space because it looks like a dangerous predator. And I just thought that was, unfortunately for the small birds, but fortunately for this cuckoo, pretty good 1-2 punch of adaptations as far as getting your young taken care of. This is a cuckoo bee. Yeah, it's a cuckoo bee, and this one's actually taking a nap, which is fantastic. You can see its mandibles are attached to the stick, and it's just kind of taking a nap there, which I wish I was able to do that. They can be brood parasites, or they can be kleptoparasites, and what they do is they often enter the nest of pollen collecting species and lay their eggs in there. The cells are usually provisioned with a ball of pollen, and the cuckoo bee larva hatches first and eats the larva's pollen ball, and very often will also eat the egg or larva of the other species. In cases where, excuse me, the cuckoo bee lays an egg in a nest of a social species, the cuckoo bee may actually grow up and remain in the host nest where it becomes a brood parasite and can lay many eggs that will be taken care of by that colony. It may even kill the queen and replace her. And so they can be a brood parasite and or a kleptoparasite. Another really good example of kleptoparasite is this guy right here. It's a great skua, and they will mercilessly go after other birds that have caught fish and getting the birds to release their fish, drop their fish, whatever the case may be, and go after them. I got to go to the Galapagos a long time ago in college, and we watched the blue-footed boobies dive in and grab fish, and they were really good at it, and they would come up, and then they would have to avoid frigate birds, which would come in and really bother the bluefoots and try to get them to drop their fish, which the frigate birds could snatch out in midair. The frigate birds did not have oils in their feathers to protect them from the water, so if they landed in the water, they were done. So they couldn't fish for themselves, but they could certainly steal that fish from the other birds that were better at catching the fish. So kleptoparasitism it can be a pretty good strategy and can be utilized by several critters. I didn't go into obligate versus facultative. Obligate means you have to do something versus facultative means, yeah, you can, maybe you don't have to. But there are some parasites that are obligate versus facultative, where if they can do it, facultative, if they can do it, great. If they can't, no worries. Where obligate, they have to do this particular process or this particular thing in order to survive. And my guess is, I don't really remember reading this. My guess is kleptoparasitism is probably utilized by many species on a very facultative manner. Whereas, like, hey, if I can get a free meal out of this, I will. Whoops. Back on here so I can advance the slide. Sexual parasitism. I don't know that this has been described in any other species. This is a species of anglerfish. When they discovered this fish, they were just finding these big females, but they kept finding these little parasites on the females. Like almost all of them seem to have this. What they discovered is that this is the male. This little nub right here is actually the male anglerfish. When you're an anglerfish and you're living deep underwater, and there's not a lot of males to find, and it's very difficult. There's not a lot of individuals. You don't have a dense population, and so it's really hard to connect. When you find a male, you keep that male. And for the males, they might spend most of their time and resources in trying to reproduce, trying to find a female. So they, they're smaller. They have enhanced senses. That's one of the theories. And so because they're underdeveloped like that, the minute they can find a female, they attach or are slightly absorbed by the female. And so they're able to get their food and nourishment from the female and protection. And again, all they're able to give the female is sperm, but that's important if you want to reproduce. And so that's where this relationship comes out. That's one of the theories. I don't know, how much that can be tested or if we might find out something different, but right now the general thought or theory on this is that the male expends a lot of energy to find that female, and once he does, it's a free ride. He's providing sperm, obviously, and she's providing protection and food. He gets food from the female, so that's how it's called parasitism. Thought I might have talked myself out of that being parasitism for a second there. Oh, and the female might mate with more than one male, and so this is one of those rare instances of polyandry where the female might actually have more than one male attached, and so the female is has multiple males that are taking care of the reproduction for her. The last one, I'm almost out of time, but I'm near the end here, is Adelphoparasitism. And this is known as sibling parasitism. The host species is closely related to the parasite. They're often in the same family or even genus. This is a citrus black fly. And if the female is unmated, she will have eggs that are haploid. That means they have half the chromosomes. She can actually lay those eggs inside the larva of this other species and produce male offspring by doing that. Um, that's another one just blows my mind. Again, some of these adaptations that parasites have are just seem like something out of a movie or out of a science fiction book. And so that's Adelphoparasitism. I don't know that there's a lot, but I feel like there's a few other insects that do this kind of parasitism, which seems really unique and really specific. Again, I'm almost at the end here, so I want to apologize specifically to Rachel, because I realized I didn't even get to zombie ants. And these are ants that end up infected with a fungus, and the fungus controls the ant, and that ant has crawled to the underside of this leaf up here. And then the fungus, excuse me, a stalk of the fungus actually bursts or emerges out of the exoskeleton of the ant and is able to release, I believe it's spores, to the air so that the new fungus can land on another ant and do the same thing. And if you're a fan of the X-Files, the show from, I know, long ago, I think in the first season they had an episode that was based on this, which was a little dramatic, but it was neat. But zombie ants are really fantastic. I always tell people that my hope is when I do one of these programs that you'll have questions, but that you'll also be inspired to investigate new things and take a look at some stuff. Again, this is the tip of the iceberg. I really just scratched the surface of the subject, that there's so much information out there on parasites. There's so many different parasites and so many things to learn, so many things we don't know. So I hope that this gets you interested in some other, in doing some reading or doing some other searching on this topic. I'm going to hold up a book here, and I'll make sure I include it in my email. This is called Parasite. Whoops, I'll come back here. There you go. Parasite Rex by Carl Zimmer. It is an older book. I think it's been around for a while, but it's a fantastic, 2000, but it's been a fantastic read. I highly recommend it. It's really good information on parasites. So that's what I've got. I hope I did such a good job that there weren't a lot of questions. But
there are
now,
a few, but I just have a couple.
Sure.
One, going back to the beginning, Ken, somebody wanted you to spell out the name of the parasite that was on the crab.
Oh, here, hold on. I had some notes. Sacculina is Sacculina. And I believe that...
Is that the genus?
The genus, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's in the Parasite Rex book. You could find probably a lot of references online. It's pretty well known, but it's a really interesting parasite.
Somebody, I don't know if you saw the comments, drawn comments, that there's a game called The Last of Us is based on some sort of parasitism. So, I don't know if that's a video game or a board game or a card game.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out. There is I can't remember. There's a game about, I don't know if is it called Pandemic? About you create a, might seem in poor taste to some people, but you create a disease to see if you can get it to spread or how it works or something like that. And I know a lot of people got interested in that game shortly after the stuff with the coronavirus, because they wanted, because it had science behind it, and they wanted to try to understand it or use it. It's certainly not a scientific model, but it was a very interesting way of seeing how different attributes of a disease are able or spread more quickly than others.
Yeah, using modeling software. Very cool.
Yeah.
And Jerron, yes, confirms that it's a video game. So.
Video game. Okay, I have to check that out.
And then Marianne has her hand up for a question.
Yeah, go ahead and unmute, Marianne. What's your question? Marianne?
Maybe not. Maybe she's all right. So.
Okay. Was that the last question that you had, Rachel?
I think so. Somebody commented they hope that ant was okay. I will say that those fungal parasites do kill their host. They are not alive at that point. And there's a lot of them. It's not just ants. They do moths and grasshoppers and all sorts of cool things. There's a great little snippet of them, like maybe a 5 or 10-minute segment that you can probably search from David Attenborough's Life of Insects, or small. There's something, maybe it's not Life of Insects, but something about small critters. I'm sure it's on YouTube.
I had a note somewhere, and I can't find it now, but there is evidence that, and it's probably multiple parasites, not just a few, that there are some parasites that in order to further along their life cycle and their those processes, that they can influence their host in such a way that it will get eaten.
Yes.
To spread them along.
That is how toxoplasmosis works.
Yeah. Thank you.
For cats, that cats carry, and that mice, they get it from mice. Mice carry the toxoplasmosis bacteria, and actually makes them attracted to cats, and they run towards cats, and they follow the scent of cats, and they're not afraid of cats, and so they're way more likely to be caught and eaten by a cat, because the cat is the primary host of the parasite to pass it along. So, and actually people can have toxoplasmosis, and they actually kind of wonder if that's how some people truly become cat obsessed, as they are affected by toxoplasmosis and have this undying affinity for cats.
I had not heard that last part, but that is fantastic. I know supposedly it's different in the any reaction that you can have to it. It's different for men versus women too, because I think if you're for men, it makes you more paranoid, I think, or it can make you more anxious. But it doesn't have the same effects. Yeah.
So someone is also asking what the name of the parasite is for the one that goes through the gills and eats out the tongue of the fish.
Oh, here, you know what?
It was like an amphipod or something.
It is an amphipod. Yep. And again, that's another one.
But if you can spell it out, I'll type it into the chat so everyone gets it correctly.
That wasn't it. I'd have to pull it up. There we go. It is, whoops. Cymathoa, so that's Cymothoa. Exigua, Exigua.
Wow, that's quite a name.
It's fantastic. Again, it's just so the first picture I saw of it, maybe I think I can show it to you, was in Parasite Rex, and it's a much better picture than what I had. Let me see if I can. And you can see in this fish where they've cut away the side of the fish head, how it's just nestled right in.
Yeah, wow.
That fish's mouth, and it's just, I can't, you know. I know I've got follicle mites, and they run back and forth and say hi to each other in my forehead at night, and that can have its moments for me. But having something to replace your tongue or a body part, oh man, that's incredible.
Yeah, I have that book. I've started it multiple times. I've never finished it, but it is super interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and Connie comments that the group of insect zombie fungus is called cordyceps. And cool. She is correct on that. So
excellent. It's like I said, I like to call these deep dives and really get into a subject deeper. And I feel like I wasn't able to do that in some ways because it's such a big subject, and there's so many parasites and the adaptations they have to survive passing through the digestive systems, to survive being out in the elements. You know, I talk about how the whale louses find a spot on the whale where they're not in the currents of the water, so they don't get yanked off, because they're just little things. Even on us, they'd be pretty tiny, and just the different things that these critters can do and how they can influence their hosts. It's stunning to me every time I read it.
So there are some calls for the sequel in the comments, Ken. Maybe we can't call this a deep dive versus scratching the surface. You know.
Yes. There you go.
Avoid the zombie scratch. You know.
I have to avoid the zombie scratch. That'd be great. I've been toying with the idea of doing one on wasps, because they are like they're just a horror show with some of with the paralyzing and the stinging and not even to us. I mean, just what they can do to other organisms and the effects they can have. And I think some of their life cycles are really complex and interesting. You know, there's so much we don't know about vertebrate animals, and we're dealing with a lot of invertebrates here, which is just still very much an open book that needs to be written by a lot of people. So, so it is 10 after. It's almost 10 after 8. If anybody has any questions and they want to just unmute themselves and go ahead and ask. Otherwise, I'm probably going to end the call here in a minute or two. But I just want to get a last round of questions. I will say we have a couple more adult programs coming up in July. If I remember correctly, I think Maddie is doing Top Predators of the DMV, and I know I have a deep dive on beating the heat, you know, surviving in a warmer season. In August, I think she's doing a Dirty Jobs program on decomposers and scavengers, and I know I'm doing a deep dive on spiders, which after doing this one, I'm like, yeah, that spiders one's probably gonna be too big a group too. But if anybody else has any questions, please feel free. And see, we're starting to have people leave out of here. So yes, go ahead.
So the game we were talking about, this is Crystal Arco. The game we were talking about, we talked about Plague Inc.
Hey, Chris, first of all, it's good to hear from you. Second of all, you broke up a little bit there. Could you give me that question again?
Any Plague Inc. that we were talking about, Plague Incorporated?
I still didn't.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, this is being recorded. I think that's what he.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's being recorded. So if you missed any of it, I'll be posting it again. It'll be on our Facebook and on, it'll be linked to on Facebook and it'll be on our YouTube channel. Was that your question? I see he's muted again. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. I'm gonna go ahead and end this then. Everybody have a great night. Take care. Hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you, Rachel, for being the moderator tonight. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jaron, for hanging out as well. And again, I appreciate everybody that was out tonight.
Okay.
Have a good one. Take care.
All right. Don't forget to stop the recording.
I'm going to do that right now.
Somehow, for some reason, it keeps going.
I just edit that out when I post it to YouTube.
All right.
But yeah, I'll go ahead and stop that right now.
All right. And Jaron, if you're still